Happy New Year, people, and welcome back to F Politics in 2025. I had an awesome New Year's Eve, in fact, the best I've ever had, but when I came back into the house at around 2 a.m., I realized that I'd missed Nigel Farage's New Year's message. I know, how could I? And so I figured I'd start 2025 by doing my favorite thing, which is showing you guys how to rip apart the narratives of people like Nigel Farage when you're chatting with your mates.
Well, I'm fortunate today to be giving you this New Year's message from Blenheim Palace, not only a magnificent place and a wonderful place to come and visit, but of course the birthplace of Winston Churchill, who represented something when this country was indeed a great country.
Okay, so we're starting off by straight copying Donald Trump, implying that there's some great moment in our history that we need to get back to, so make Britain great again.
Not just in terms of looking after its own people.
Looking after its own people? In Winston Churchill's first term, we didn't actually have the NHS yet, so we didn't have the National Health Service. The government wasn't looking after its own people. In his second term, that was just after the war, there was rationing, so the government was technically starving its own people. In fact, in the current cost of living crisis, the fall in living standards is often said to be the worst since the time of Churchill. And that's what Nigel Farage wants us to go back to. And he also praises Churchill for
standing up for the right things in the world.
But Churchill is on record as saying that nothing wrong was done to the indigenous people in Australia and America because a stronger race, a more worldly wise race, a higher grade race, i.e. a superior race, came in and took their place. So Nigel Farage is describing racist mass slaughter as standing up for the right things in the world. And he goes on to explain what's wrong with the UK today.
We have been appallingly led in this country now for several decades.
That's interesting coming from the person who set the agenda of the UK government for the last decade, because the reason David Cameron called the EU referendum in 2016 in the first place was because he was scared of losing votes to UKIP, who were offering to take us out of the EU. So the Brexit that Nigel Farage brought about has set the policy agendas of both major parties for the last 10 years. His Brexit has affected every single area of our lives. It's affected our NHS, it's affected our economy, it's affected our trade, it's affected our businesses, it's affected our international relations. So if we've been appallingly led for the last decade, it's because of Nigel Farage. And he uses an interesting analogy to explain why it's the people at the top who we should blame.
You know, the fish rots from the head down.
That's the first time I've heard Nigel Farage mention fish in a very long time, because before we left the EU, he was saying
fishing.
Absolutely.
So the acid test for Brexit is fishing?
I think it is.
And now the UK fishing industries are reporting losses of hundreds of millions of pounds because of Brexit, including leaving lots of fish rotting because they can no longer sell them. So Nigel Farage using rotting fish as an analogy is so on the nose.
We are in economic decline. Most people are getting poorer with every year that passes.
And here's one of your Reform Party candidates explaining why we're getting poorer.
You know, we're getting poor for a variety of reasons, of which Brexit is one.
We're losing any sense of national identity.
Yeah, they've been playing this identity card for a while, which is funny for a couple of reasons. For starters, these are the same people who moan about identity politics whenever anybody pushes for equality. But also, like, when you think of British identity, what are like the things that the average person could actually hold in their hands that represent British identity? What comes to mind? For me, it would be like my passport, the pound coin. But Nigel Farage, via Brexit, has literally devalued both of those things. The British passport no longer grants us the automatic right to live and work in any country in Europe, so the British passport is literally worth less because of Nigel Farage. Brexit also lowered the value of the British pound. Not to mention, Brexit made us a global laughingstock, so it damaged our identity on the international stage. So Nigel Farage is the last person I would turn to save British identity.
And we're actually teaching kids at school that people like Winston Churchill, born in this palace, are bad people.
I mean, if you're in charge of an empire and you run other countries as colonies, and one of the countries under your control, you oversee the deaths of 3 million people through starvation while you're taking food away from that country, while spouting ideology about how some races deserve to live more than others, yeah, I feel like bad person's kind of accurate.
And that our country's history is something to be ashamed of.
I mean, as Brits, we've done some cool stuff. We've invented some cool shit. You just don't like when we talk about the bad stuff we've done as well.
It was also because I'd fought so hard and so long for us to get back our independence. Brexit, taking back control of our own lives, and to see that completely squandered by a Conservative Party.
Okay, so you fought for Brexit, a Brexit which your party admits has made us poorer.
We haven't actually benefited from Brexit economically.
And you're saying the other parties wasted the opportunities of Brexit. They didn't do Brexit properly. But the Brexit that you were trying to push through was no deal Brexit. At least now we have a trade deal with the EU. You're talking about having no trade deal at all, meaning there'll be tariffs, charges on everything that we buy and sell from the EU. So the damage that Brexit has already done, which your party has admitted to, would be much worse if you had been in charge of Brexit. So blaming other parties for doing a less damaging version of what you told them to do is kind of wild. But he continues pointing the finger at the Tories for Brexit.
Who frankly never believed in it, but used it for electoral advantage.
I mean, yeah, that's all true, because the experts the Tory government was relying on were telling them that any version of Brexit they negotiated would make people poorer. So the Tories never believed the lies that they were telling about what Brexit would deliver for people. They did just use it for political gain, but Nigel Farage is no different. Brexit is what made him. And yes, I'm aware that I'm speaking as somebody whose platform only exists because of Brexit, but everything that I've said about Brexit has more or less come true. Nigel Farage, not so much. Now, after blowing his own trumpet about his election success in 2024, he says
that with just a handful of MPs, we've made a real impact over the course of these last 6 months.
Yeah, you got a convicted woman beater into Parliament, you incited race riots that saw people trying to burn down hotels with refugees inside, you defended the rioters online and campaigned to get the organisers of the riots released so they could do it all again. You really have made a huge impact on UK politics in just 6 months.
And everything we do is based on values.
You mean like accepting tens of millions of pounds in political donations from an American billionaire Elon Musk after you said this about Jewish Holocaust survivor George Soros?
It is wholly inappropriate for someone like George Soros to try and destabilise this democracy and this government, because he's an overseas. He doesn't live here. He doesn't pay taxes here. What right has he got to interfere with our democracy and try and overthrow the government? He has no right at all, and he should withdraw.
Your values are looking a little thin.
And those values are around the things that matter to us. Family.
Your main policy took £1,000 a year from every family in the country.
Community.
You sparked riots that led to communities hunting each other.
And country.
Country? He's trying to get 2 foreign billionaires to control the UK in a way that he knows will harm the UK. Because when he says
Donald Trump coming back as the American president is good news,
he knows that Donald Trump has explicitly said that in any trade deal he does with us, he will make the NHS pay more for drugs so that American companies pay less. And he wants us to bow down to Donald Trump because,
let's face it, without America, we are defenseless. So that relationship is crucial.
And the ironic thing is that he uses this reason for why we need Donald Trump in the world.
The dictators and bad guys only respect strength.
The man has already tried to overthrow an election, so he already has the mindset of a dictator. He is the bad guy. So Nigel Farage saying that dictators like Donald Trump only respond to strength, while publicly saying that without America, the UK is defenseless, after Nigel Farage supported Brexit, which split us off from the rest of Europe, making us like the single gazelle that's been split off from the herd, Nigel Farage may as well be admitting that he is the one that has made us weak and vulnerable to Donald Trump.
And we're going to campaign for us to look at history in a different way, for our kids to be proud of who we are as a nation.
The irony being that anybody who did actually study history would remember that in Germany they indoctrinated kids in school to make them believe that their country was the best, that they were better than everybody else, and that's what allowed them to do the things they did later. So anybody who did actually know their history would run a mile from anybody talking like this. Especially when it was the propaganda of people like Nigel Farage that told us that we, the UK, were so much better than the EU that 27 countries needed trade with our one country more than we needed trade with 27 countries? Leading to conversations like this. You are arguing that one country is needed by 27 countries more than 27 countries are needed by one country.
Absolutely right.
That would imply that that one country is inherently better than 27 countries combined.
Bang on! Congratulations, you've hit the nail on the head. We are the 5th largest economy in the world.
Yep.
We are. And what? So you think we are? And what? So you think?
And according to the government's own experts, the consequence of that British superiority has been more damaging to our economy than the pandemic. So when it comes to learning history, we don't even need to go back as far as World War II to know how dangerous people like Nigel Farage are.
We're going to campaign for proper border controls. A Conservative Party in power promising us that net migration will be tens of thousands a year, and it was nearly 1 million.
In 2017, I spoke to Nigel Farage and got him to admit that the EU had controls on immigration, and I told him that if we left the EU, immigration would rise.
Femi, in theory, you're right. In theory, under European treaties, there are restrictions that can be placed.
Logically speaking, if the EU has restrictions on immigration and the UK hasn't been implementing them, leaving the EU would mean more immigration.
And he went ahead with Brexit anyway, so for him to complain now about border controls and rising immigration means he thinks you're stupid.
The fact that now 150,000 people, nearly all of them young men, have been able to catch dinghies across the English Channel and come into this country, frankly, is an outrage to everybody.
Yeah, the narrative about it being mostly young men that come to the UK on these boats, if you make it so that the only way to claim asylum in the UK is to cross the most dangerous shipping lane in the world, do you think it's going to be mainly women and children that make that crossing? Or do you think it'll be the young men in those families that mainly make that crossing first, take that risk, and then try and get their families across safely later? Which is why the majority of Brits want the government to create safe and legal routes for people to get here and claim asylum.
We're going to campaign to reduce the cost of living.
Brexit is responsible for 1/3 of food price increases. So again, if the man who raised your food prices tells you he's going to help you with the cost of living crisis, he thinks you're stupid.
We want to make this country prouder.
2/3 of Brits are less proud of the UK since we left the EU. Well done.
We want to make our people better off.
Your party has admitted that if you got into power, your no-deal Brexit would damage our food supply for the next 20 years.
Sometimes you have to take, you have to swallow your medicine to get better in the future. So this is maybe a 5-year, 10-year, 20-year plan.
Does that sound like being better off?
We think of Churchill, we think of what he meant in 1940, and the fact we managed to extinguish with our American colleagues Nazism.
Nigel Farage, including himself in that we of defeating Nazism, when him and Richard Tice, the current owners of the Reform Party, used to run a campaign called Leave.eu, and the communications director of Leave.eu, a man called Andy Wigmore, said the campaign that he ran with them was similar to the Nazis. And in my view, when one of your closest allies says that your messaging was basically Nazi propaganda of the 21st century, you don't get to take credit for defeating Nazism. And given that Nigel Farage in 2024 spurred on the race riots that saw people with my skin tone violently hunted in the streets, I find his choice of words here interesting.
The only way we get reform in our country that so badly needs it is if you, who agree with us, join our people's army. Join Reform UK. Join the fight back.
Fight back against who? Because your former deputy leader, Ben Habib, has already said what you consider woke to be.
The way that woke has been created is through the passing of regulations and laws that in the end promote ethnic minorities, religious minorities, minority sexual preferences, and then the whole transgender ideology lot, promote them over and above, and if necessary, and more often than not, to the detriment of the majority.
I think what Reform offers for 2025 is exciting.
So that fight back doesn't really excite me as much as it excites him.
Let's make Britain great again.
Oh, so we're fully doing the Trump plagiarism thing. Cool. I'm Femi. Make sure you follow F Politics so politics doesn't F you. Have a happy new year.